With us now is Dan Abbasi. He is director of MissionPoints Capital Partners, and he's joining us now from Stamford, Connecticut. Dan, good to have you with us this morning.
Thanks, Tyler. Good to be here.
Let's talk about your idea of a climate change index. And you were saying this grew out of a sense that there's an overwhelming amount of information out there about climate change, but that information isn't being distilled by the public necessarily, at least not in large numbers.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I start from the premise that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today, and that while there is broad public concern out there, there really is, very few people really realize how serious it is, how irreversible it is, and in fact how much it's accelerating. You know, scientists are continually coming back from the field surprised and are saying that, the impacts are much more serious than they appeared to be just 2 years ago. So as we enter into the fall, into this legislative debate, I was looking for a way to both deal with that awareness gap, but also to incorporate a provision into the bill that passed the House and will be pending in the Senate that would basically strengthen the understanding of those impacts and create a mechanism by which we could tighten emissions targets in the future if indeed the science continues to worsen as it has been.
Well, Dan, let's talk about that bill. We're discussing Waxman-Markey, an unprecedented move by Congress, one house actually passing an emissions reduction plan. But your complaint echoes that of a number of those in the environmental community, that the emission cuts here laid out by Waxman-Markey simply aren't strong enough to do any good.
Yeah, exactly. There's already a significant gap between Europe and the United States in terms of what kinds of targets are embedded there, and the Europeans are saying that the targets that we have in Waxman-Markey, which are based on a 2005 baseline, are just inadequate in light of the science, that they're not commensurate to the threat we face. So my thought was we have to create a mechanism where we take the voluminous data that you referenced and we distill it down so it doesn't overwhelm people. And so that we deal with this polarized political process by trying to insulate this a little bit from the political calculations. Right now we're in a world where horse trading and political negotiating is determining those targets. We really need this to be rooted in the science.
Well, let's talk about the mechanism that you're proposing here, Dan. And I want to read a quote to you from your recent article saying now that tucked away in the bill, referring to Waxman-Markey, is a little discussed but ultimately crucial provision informally referred to as the scientific look-back. And that measure, strengthened by a global climate change index, as you're proposing, Dan, could put teeth back into the legislation. Through this idea, it sounds like the onus is really on the EPA and the NAS for implementing a lot of this.
That's right. The current model that's embedded in the House version says that in 2013, EPA will do a review of the science, of the emissions targets, their adequacy, and also of the solutions, some of which we're investing in at MissionPoint. The National Academy of Sciences then has 1 year to review EPA's report, so you're into 2014, and then the President, as of 2015, would have an obligation to potentially make changes in the policy within statutory limits and recommend changes to the Congress. And that's good, and there are a lot of scientists who've worked very hard on this, from the Union of Concerned Scientists to many others, to create that provision. My view, though, is that we need, because we've witnessed this being such a politicized process, so we need to strengthen it, make it a little more prescriptive by having an index that would basically indicate it would be a composite of a set of indicators of climate change impacts around the world that would then be distilled down into quantified form, and that would indicate whether or not the rate of change and the intensification of climate change is happening at a rate that we really need to change those targets. And that would put the burden really on those who would say, no, we don't need to. Right now, there's this complex, inaccessible information, and it's kind of a wide open ideological debate. What we need to do is create a presumption or a prescriptive drive toward tightening, if in fact that's what the science calls for, and put the onus on those who would argue against that.
Mm-hmm. What about the set of...
And I'm also arguing that it should be faster. So after that cycle I just described, it repeats on in the current legislation, it repeats every 4 years. And I'm arguing we should be doing these indices should be adjusting on a continuous basis, that we should all be watching them, and that there should be something more like a yearly readjustment in those targets if that's what the science is indicating.
Now, Dan, you mentioned a set of indicators for gauging this index. Deforestation, sea level rise, glacial retreat, those are some of the ones that you mentioned, but it sounds like a big enough controversy just agreeing on the indicators, much less establishing this index.
Well, I think it's going to be, my article is really intended as a provocation. I'm not a scientist. I've spent a lot of time with them, and frankly, I know how conservative they are. So this is not an easy thing to, for them to accept in some ways, because they've got so much complex, nuanced data. To ask them to participate in this reductionist exercise is really difficult for them. But I have been reaching out to scientists, and I've been saying, look, can we find the ones that are reasonably stable, so they're not going to be prone to short-term oscillations that could be misleading, but that are going to be dynamic enough to reflect the kind of change that they're seeing from the field. We see these periodic articles here and there saying the scientists are coming back concerned, the permafrost is melting at a much faster rate than we had expected. But right now there's no mechanism to connect the dots between that and the policy. So I think, what we're looking to is an exercise where we'd really get together the leading scientists. They would have to put their expert lens into this in terms of determining which of the index, which of the elements would go into this composite index, which of the indicators would be most appropriate.
Well, it sounds like a natural concern here would be false signals, gauging or using the wrong indicators.
Yeah, and I think there is a risk of that. There's also a risk of short-term. We can have multi-year periods of cooling, if there's a volcanic eruption comparable to Pinatubo in the past. I mean, there are things that could throw this off over the short term. So having something that has this kind of continuous feedback loop going on does run the risk of a false signal. That's why what I've suggested is not that the adjustment in the targets would be mechanical. There would still need to be that supplementary expert lens that would go in and that would potentially do adjustments based on some false feedback that we might get, but also up front to really select, if we select the right indicators and get rid of those that would be prone to short-term oscillation, then I think we can have a reasonably useful mechanism here.
Dan, final question for you. You mentioned the issue of flexibility in terms of emission caps and the systems we use to reach these target goals. I want to read one more quote to you from your recent article. A group of top scientists would be charged with devising a continuously updated index of measurable climate change impacts. And you go on to say they would provide guidance on whether caps on carbon should be raised or lowered. That seems like something that is absent from the legislation that passed the House and that eventually will be addressed by the Senate. That is flexibility of targets and goals.
Right. Yeah, it's not in there, and the drive, the general political drive is going to be, while the environmentalists are doing a good job pushing for strong targets, there's a lot of vested interest in keeping those targets, less stringent. And so this, let's suppose that, if we're fortunate enough to really get the bill through, and I should add, I do think that the House-passed legislation is historic, it's important, and should be passed. But I think if we can just strengthen it in a few places, like this look-back provision, we'll have a mechanism that will incorporate really a prudent degree of flexibility that will be dynamic in being able to respond to this science. We already know that the IPCC report from a couple of years ago is already outdated by what we're seeing in the field, what the impacts that we're seeing. So it's just vital that we incorporate that feedback loop into the legislation itself and into the law that ultimately will be passed.
Dan Abbasi is proposing a climate change index, what he calls a kind of Dow Jones index for global warming. Dan, joining us from Stamford, Connecticut. Again, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you.